My name is Jackie Moulton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning. My name's Jackie Moulton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. Today I'm going to be looking at the case of Fred and Rosemary West. This couple still continue to attract the attention of the public and the media, and I think that interest in the West case comes from trying to understand why this couple inflicted so much depravity and torture on many of the victims who were vulnerable, and that Fred and Rose West initially offered these young girls some love and nurturing that they had not previously experienced. Often many were from broken homes, and just offering them a glass of orange juice and biscuits sucked them in, and they all subsequently were abused, tortured and murdered. It's very, very hard to comprehend how two human beings could inflict so much pain and agony to young, vulnerable victims and their own children.
Hello?
Oh, is that you, Howard Ogden?
Hello.
Hi to you. My name's Jackie Moulton. I'm ex-detective from Scotland Yard. I just wondered whether or not that you would be willing to speak to me, because I understand, Howard, that you were Fred West's defence solicitor from the point of time when he was arrested for murder.
That's absolutely correct, and yes, I'm happy to talk to you.
I'm fascinated to meet solicitor Howard Ogden. The relationship between police and defence lawyers is always professional, but not necessarily easy. And I can only imagine the tension in the police interrogation room as one of the biggest murder investigations in history was about to unfold. This is the first full interview Howard Ogden has ever agreed to give.
I was actually en route to Stroud Magistrates Court as the phone went to say that Fred had been arrested, and because my mind was really on where I had to go and the case I was going to do over at Stroud, I just gave him the sort of time-honoured solicitor's advice: keep your mouth shut, Fred, and I'll see you later when I get there. To which I got the reply, well, I've already admitted it.
Fred West had admitted to the murder of his daughter, Heather. Police were digging up the garden at his house at 25 Cromwell Street, following escalating rumours that he had killed his teenage daughter and buried her there. As Howard Ogden arrived at the police station, he and the other officers present were quickly seeing the Jekyll and Hyde character of a man who was about to be revealed as a serial killer.
Fred was a different personality with different people. Fred was very respectful of authority. Fred was a staunch Thatcherite. He played all us professionals off against one another. If he met a counsel appointed in the case or a doctor, he would be extremely polite and extremely courteous Once that was over, and he and I were discussing interviews, and I was getting his instructions, he spoke with the speed of a machine gun going off, and I had to remove in my mind the expletives that were dotted about in it in order to get his actual instructions as to what the position was.
Can you remember how you felt in that first interview?
The first interview was chilling. It rather set the scene for subsequent interviews, in that here were four complete strangers. The traditional view of the detective meeting the defence lawyer is that we're kind of daggers drawn and we're opposites. Yet, by the time we got to the end of that interview, it was something that none of us had come across professionally before, because of the matter-of-fact way in which horrific details were being given to us by Fred. And at the end, these four complete strangers, we just stood, and we left that interview, and there was a little tea room just outside, and we actually had what I could only describe as a group hug.
As I'll find out later, any relief Howard or those present were to feel would be short-lived, as the full horrors of the case began to unfold in the preceding days. How could these crimes have taken place in a respectable cathedral city such as Gloucester?
You look around Gloucester and it's hard to imagine how this could have gone on in the middle of a bustling city centre. But as a detective, you sometimes have to figure out what's been going on behind closed doors.
One man who went through the closed doors of Cromwell Street was given the task by the official solicitor in documenting in detail all of the materials gathered on Fred and Rose West after their arrest.
I'm now going to speak to Geoffrey Wansall, who was appointed the official biographer of Fred West, and was given unique access to the prison diaries that Fred completed, the audio evidence against him, and the video evidence taken by the police to compile the case against Fred West.
Geoffrey Wansall has agreed to meet me at the site where 25 Cromwell Street once stood, the house now demolished to make way for a thoroughfare that we both now stand upon. It's the first time Geoffrey has been back since the horrors of the case unfolded. He remains the only civilian to have ever seen all of the materials seized by the police from the house.
What does it feel like to be back at the site of 25 Cromwell Street, because you were so embroiled in this story as the official biographer?
Frankly, it's spine-chilling. It brings not tears, but melancholy. This was a place where horrible, horrible things happened to perfectly innocent young women who were looking for love and found instead death. They were abused, tortured, mutilated, buried, all on this very spot. And there's no way I can come back to this street and not feel really dreadful. It's as if someone's treading on your spine, as if ghost is looking over your shoulder.
Regarding the archives of Fred West, how did you get hold of them? Where were they? What was the process? How did you do it?
Well, it was very eerie. Rose's trial had begun on the Tuesday, and on that weekend I was summoned to a solicitor's office in London where I had to meet a little man at 11 o'clock. And the only thing in the room is a big grey double-doored filing cabinet. He says, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to lock you in. You can't take anything out, and I'm going to have to search you when you leave. Shuts the door, locks it, and I'm left there. I open this filing cabinet, and it's a complete jumble. And right in the middle is a cardboard box. So I take out the cardboard box and I put it on the table, and inside is Frederick West's clothes, all the way down to his underpants and his shoes. I think if there was one moment in which my life changed, it was at that moment. And even today, I can capture it in my mind. Yeah, I swallowed, put the box back, and picked up an audio tape completely random, and I put it into the little cassette player, and I pressed play. Police interview. I'd just like to give us your name for the benefit of the tape, Fred. Frederick Walter Stephen West. OK, we want to talk to you about Heather. What happened exactly, Fred? Well, you see, Rose had gone out shopping and Heather was in a bad temper anyway. Well, I killed her. She was being difficult.
The grounds that Geoffrey and I are standing on would be where the remains of the West daughter Heather were to be found. But the discovery of her body would sadly prove to be the first of many found in the garden that the Wests had turned into a cemetery. I'm in Gloucester reinvestigating the horrific crimes committed by killing couple Fred and Rose West. And I'm en route to meet the man the detectives asked to assist them with interviewing Fred West, a killer of which the likes of Gloucester police had never seen before or since.
Professor Paul Britton, consultant psychologist. In 1994, you were asked by Gloucestershire Police to help them with a case of Fred West.
They had a man, Frederick West, who was in custody, but they couldn't really make sense of at that stage. He was friendly, he was affable, and his story was that he had got into arguments with 3, I think it was, young women, one of them his daughter, and out of the arguments they had accidentally died. And instead of him doing what he now knows he should have done, he thought he would get into trouble, so he thought he would hide it. And being a builder, he hid these people under the patio. He buried them in the garden. And this was something that the police officers were finding difficult to make sense of and wanted to know how best to talk to him, because as they began to talk to him in those early stages, he seemed to slip away from them.
How did you build up a picture of Fred West and Cromwell Street in order to help the police?
I need to know as much as I possibly can about the people concerned. So I have access to files going back years that deal with earlier offences. And it involves not just Frederick West, but even more centrally, his wife, Mrs. West. And I look at that, and of course, sadly, I have seen those personalities, those temperaments, those activities many times before. The thing that's absolutely clear is that you're dealing with 2 serial predators.
What drives Fred and Rose West to behave and groom and murder these innocent victims in such a way?
I think when you describe, as you just have, the bestiality and the direction that they went, you really go to the heart of the difficulty that confronted the investigating officers. You're looking at people who are ordinary, normal human beings. They go home to their wives, husbands, children at the end of the day. And the extent of the depravity, the sadism, the torture that the Wests visited will be the first time that most of those officers have ever encountered anything like that. And sadly, it will never go away from them. I'm in the position of at least being partially removed from it. Although I was there, I was in Cromwell Street, I've seen all of the things, it didn't fall to me to put the spade in the floor and go through the black, gloopy mess that was the remains of these young women.
Tragically, that messy mixture of mud and sewage would also contain the human remains of innocent victims, the numbers of which were about to escalate at an alarming rate. Someone who did find themselves subjected to wading through the quagmire looking for human remains was legendary Home Office pathologist Professor Bernard Knight.
Pitch dark, of course, and pouring the rain, and they had their tent up and a hole in the ground where people had been digging down. We were all assuming that there was one body there, because the thigh bone which I saw in the police station was a left-sided one. And of course the crunch came when I found another left femur. And I remember telling John Bennett, "You've got more than one body." I can't remember exactly how many there were in the garden, But I remember one that was pregnant because we found the remains of a fetus in it.
And was that process of digging in Cromwell Street kind of a really slow process?
Yes, yes. They were thick with mud. It was so bad that sometimes I had rubber boots on and I was stuck in the hole. And on one occasion at least, the police had to lift me out of my boots.
Because you were stuck?
Yeah, well, this is the sort of environment that these bits were lying in. And I think that Fred had also broken the sewer. So we had sewage mixed up in this mix as well.
With the eventual discovery of 5 bodies in the garden, the excavations moved into the basement where further bodies would be retrieved. Some of them were more intact than those from the garden and showed evidence of the torture that had been inflicted upon them.
Some of the ones in the cellar had what you might call masks. What they would have either a belt or a piece of clothing tied around the head so that it supported the chin. And at least one had polythene tubes pushed up the nostril.
Like straws or something?
Yes, in order to produce air, to convey air.
It's an anathema to even imagine what that would be like.
People always ask me, how can you do such a horrible job?
But you're a scientist, a pathologist, your job, isn't it, to find the cause of death, what happened?
I think it's a process of natural selection. If you can't do the job, you don't do it.
Disturbed by the details of the forensic dig that Professor Knight had shared with me, I'm returning to see Professor Paul Britton to try and get an understanding of how the West could have even imagined, let alone committed, these kinds of crimes.
You have previously described them as sexual psychopaths.
Yes. I mean people who feel no remorse, no conscience at the pain and the suffering of the people they're interacting with, so that their victims are not there any longer as people. They are there purely as instruments and objects for the pleasure of the Wests. There were the masks, there were the bindings, and you will see that the masks progress from simple covers to including devices that ensure that the victims experience prolonged terror. They can't see, they can't speak, but they must be kept alive to breathe. Now, how did they do that? Well, they punch a tooth out and they push a pipe through the mask so that they can still breathe. Now, the terror is so thrilling, but it's never quite enough. There's always something else we might think of.
As I gradually gain a better understanding of the background of these crimes, I recall when I first heard the names Fred and Rose West, names now synonymous with serial murder and sadism.
I was serving as a detective in the Metropolitan Police when the West case was starting to be investigated. And I remember, Gloucestershire Police, not a big police force, but the magnitude of dealing with this huge number of victims and the police not knowing who they were or where they came from. They had nothing. They had, sadly, hundreds and hundreds of bones and skeletons and nothing else. And so this is where forensic evidence is crucial. It is the lead in the sense of a murder investigation.
I'm about to meet the forensic experts who led the way in identifying all of the young women murdered by the Wests.
Professor David Whitaker, you are a world-renowned forensic dentist. What does that mean?
My technology at that time, we're talking 25 years ago, was principally based on reconstructing the face from photographs and so on, and superimposing details from a high-quality photograph showing the teeth, but not only the teeth, the eyes, the mouth, and making those images fit with the set of remains that I was brought. So my job was explained to me really as being, can you find out who these girls they were then, who they are? I was told that there were about 10,000 missing females in the UK round about this time. I decided early on that I would need to age at death each of the sets of remains as they became available, because that would narrow down the field enormously. From 10,000 it came down to hundreds.
So the identification primarily of these poor victims comes from you?
Yes. Pretty well entirely, yeah. I mean, there were inevitably other issues that the detectives are all working on. There's a big team. Of all the cases I've done, 800 or more, this one stands out to me as brilliant policing.
Were there any peculiarities of dental records or identification?
There was one skull which had 4 teeth missing. One, we call it the lateral tooth. And what I did was to take out the other one. We call it the contralateral tooth. So I got a technician to make a tooth, but swapped through 360 degrees. And he did it. And I slotted that into the socket, and it went in as if it had been there forever. And the thing about it was sticking out into the lip, as teeth sometimes do. And when the photographs arrived, I couldn't believe it. Both of them showed this tooth sticking out into the lip.
Protruding tooth.
A protruding tooth. And it was that feature that clinched her identity.
David Whittaker's work saw many families able to give their loved ones a proper burial. But I do fear that there are other victims we still don't know about.
Only Rose West can answer those questions now, but I doubt whether she thinks it's in her best interest to do so.
As husband of Fred sat before the police recounting his crimes in graphic detail, police became convinced that he could not have hidden the extent of his crimes from Rose. So she too found herself under arrest and brought in for questioning. One man who came to know Rose West better than most was a solicitor who was called in to defend her, Leo Goatley.
Hello?
Oh, is that Mr. Goatley?
Yes.
Hi Leo, my name's Jackie Moulton. I'm ex-Scotland Yard detective. I'm just looking into the case of Fred and Rose West, and I understand you were the defence solicitor for Rosemary West.
That's right.
I wondered if I could come and see you, Leo, see if I could kind of understand through you what was going on in the mind of Rosemary West and your knowledge of her.
Yeah, I'd agree to that.
So when you interviewed Rose West, what did you think about her?
A complete contrast with the dreadful nature of the allegation. Here was a rather frumpy wife of a builder, a hard-working mum. She was always communicative and sociable with me, but it was on her terms. She wouldn't be challenged. If you took her out of a comfort zone, it would be a different matter.
Mm. Not you, Leo Goatley, as a solicitor, but you, Leo Goatley, as a father, husband. What's going on inside of you?
At that stage, I wasn't convinced of her guilt, but there was an awful lot of evidence accumulating. I suspect by the trial, mindful of the due process, I would have had my doubts. I was trying to remain professional and stay focused that Rose West was my client and she was denying any knowledge. So of course it was deeply disturbing, horrific, and you have to try and deal with that.
So are you quite happy with that answer now?
Yeah, I've no doubt that Rose West was complicit, but it's 25 years ago and I've had a lot of time to think about it. It's not a decision that I could come to as in a flash. I've pondered it for a long time.
If we look back at Rose and her own upbringing with her father, Bill Letts.
Well, there was a huge disconnect between what she actually told me, which was rather idealised. She wrote a lengthy proof of evidence The police were saying, hang on, they were telling me that Rose West had been abused. She was denying that. She only admitted it after the trial. But there's no doubt that there was ingrained serious intergenerational incest in her family in the same way there was in Fred West's family. And that is, in my view, a major factor in her development. So Bill Letts singled Rose out, and he groomed her and abused her probably from an early age, and that would have resulted in full sex by the time she was about 11 or 12, I think.
Is it true that that carried on even as an adult when she was still, in fact she was married to Fred?
Fred West used to invite Bill Letts to the house, and he would encourage Rose to have sex with Bill Letts whilst he watched. And I always felt that the sex with Rose, it was like her currency and had been from an early stage. It's what made her daddy's pet. It's what stopped her being beaten like her siblings. And I think she carried that through.
Almost like perfunctory.
Yeah, and as a nubile young girl, blokes liked her if they could have sex with her. And
Rose West's extremely abusive upbringing at the hands of her incestuous father must have been both emotionally and psychologically damaging. But I'm wondering if forensic psychologist Professor Paul Britton can shed any light on what part, if any, these early years may have played in West's genesis as a serial killer.
I wanted to ask you about Fred West's first kind of sexual encounter was with his mother and vice versa, that Rose West's first encounter was with her own father. That was part of her learned behaviours and therefore a shared history between the two of them.
Out in the world, there are thousands of youngsters, boys, girls, who are abused within families and elsewhere on an intergenerational basis. A very, very small number of those go on to become the sort of creatures that Rose and Frederick West became. They didn't have to go down this pathway. I think that is more true for Frederick West than for Rosemary West. I think that once she became bonded with him, he opened the doors, liberated the possibilities of the depravity that came in her. If she'd encountered someone else who didn't have those propensities, she might not have gone down that sort of pathway. Once she was launched, no stopping her.
Even as a seasoned detective myself, I'm finding much of the information about this case difficult to comprehend. I can only imagine the mental toll it must have taken on those who were having to experience it firsthand, perhaps none more so than Fred West's defence solicitor, Howard Ogden.
Your role is that of a solicitor to defend him, but how does Howard Ogden, you know, the family man, the father, how did you feel?
I can't imagine a more conflicting situation than representing Fred. I had a role of looking after him to a degree in that respect, the humanitarian bit, if you like. The police station was given temporary prison status so as to avoid any transportation between the custody suite and the prison. So my role involved things like doing his washing, organising a haircut, organising videos to keep him entertained. I also had to deal with artifacts that were being removed, like, for example, the fish that I had to take control of in the fish tank. But people do challenge and say, well, how can you do it? How can you represent somebody like this? You don't have choices in this sense. You are obliged to follow it through. You can't pick and choose what you're going to do or who you're going to represent.
When you went to visit him in prison, did you start to see any decline in his mental health?
I never found any decline in mental health, and I was, to say the least, surprised when I was told one New Year's Day, when I was down in the custody suite in Gloucester and taken aside by a senior officer to advise me that Fred had been found.
What did you feel yourself?
I did not, and still do not, find it credible that Fred took his own life.
Are you inferring that he was killed?
I can't say what did or didn't happen. All I can say is from my dealings with Fred, I think that takes a degree of courage to take your own life. And I didn't find him to have that form of courage at all.
This startling admission by Howard Ogden may be at odds with the official inquiry into Fred West's death, which found he had taken his own life. But one thing is for certain, Fred's death threw the whole murder trial into chaos, and in doing so brought Rose's involvement in the crimes more closely into focus. Fred and Rose West were bound in a murderous union where sexual sadism and murder became part of the fabric of their everyday life. Detectives in Gloucester could never have been prepared for a series of serial murders such as these that have happened on their patch. But when they realised what was happening, they acted impeccably and brought in leading experts to help assist and ensure justice was done. One of their focuses was to ensure they achieved everything possible from the interviews in the police interrogation room.
One of the duties that I felt I had with the investigators early in the case was to explain that their work with Frederick West was very important to him. I'd help the officers to develop a working relationship with him that allowed them to put their repugnance to one side. And what I had to explain is that that's fine, but do understand that when you move him to a holding prison and your contact reduces and it's clear that Rose has repudiated him, he will kill himself.
Oh, gosh.
And of course,
you anticipated that?
Yeah, to explain that, all of that narcissistic pleasure would fall away. He would no longer have the apparent resource of Rose. He would kill him. Remember, he'd seen how many people die. He'd been involved in it. He knew what dying's all about. He took himself away. But it's not going to happen to Rose West. She's much, much stronger.
The death of Fred West on remand now put the police's spotlight firmly on wife Rose, especially in relation to the disappearance and death of their daughter Charmaine. I'm returning to meet solicitor Leo Goatley to see how this shift in the investigation saw Rose West become a prime suspect in the case.
So it all changes for Rose, doesn't it, Leo, when Fred kills himself on New Year's Day of 1995?
Yeah, that is a significant moment. It's at that point that some people are saying, oh, well, she shouldn't face trial. I actually went to visit her on the 1st of January 95, within about an hour or two of it being announced that Fred had hung himself at Winson Green.
Did she know, or did you tell her?
I had to tell her, and you know, her response was conflicted. On the one hand, I think there was a kind of glow of excitement, a feeling that this was it, she wasn't going to have to face a trial. But I think she also betrayed a slight kind of sadness that she didn't want to admit that, you know, Fred was dead. It was only a few days later that the police said, no, we want to interview her again about Charmaine. And then she was charged with Charmaine, and any sense of hope that it might all be over was soon dashed.
Charmaine's remains had been found buried under an old garage pit at the West's former marital home on Midland Road. I'm on my way back to see forensic dentist Professor David Whittaker. Finding out the date of Charmaine's death would prove to be imperative if police were able to prove she had been killed by Rose West. In doing so, increasing the culpability of her involvement in the many other deaths.
Can I ask you, David, specifically about the case of Charmaine West? Can you talk me through your evidence?
Yeah, and I started working on Charmaine. This set of remains was the only child. Now, this means that her face was growing and the teeth are developing in length, in size, and so on. And all of that information was in the skull, in the remains of this body from 25 Midland Road, but it was also in the photographs. So I could age this unfortunate young child to within about 3 months either way. Unfortunately, the negatives, the photographer had written on the negatives the day on which they were taken. So I had a day when the photograph was taken, I had the skull and the teeth had moved. Now, I know from, being a dental forensic guy, more or less how the rate at which this growth occurs. And I knew that this child had died a certain number of weeks after the photograph was taken. Now, I'd suspected when I got the photograph that I might be able to do this. And that is why I said to the police, I'm not going to look at the media. And I signed a document saying that because they had let slip, the police had, that Frederick West had been in jail round about the time that they thought Charmaine had died. The brilliance of it was that when I went to trial as a witness, expert witness in Winchester, Defence QC, he said, tell the court when Frederick West was in jail. So I paused and said, no. I said to the judge, my lord, I actually signed an affidavit with the police not to seek this information when Frederick West was in jail. And as I stand here now, my answer is correct. I cannot tell him when Frederick West was in jail. And that's when the adrenaline flows away and you think, you don't show it in what you think, got it.
The damning evidence accrued by Professor Whittaker would condemn Rose West forever as a serial killer. With a growing body of evidence stacking up against her, it fell to the defence solicitor Leo Goatley to try to process it all and present it to his clients.
Did Rose West ever admit killing anyone?
No. And as far as I know, she still hasn't. What she did admit after the trial, which I personally thought was very significant, was she said that everything Anne-Marie had said was true, or she'd been absolutely adamant that everything Anne-Marie said was a lie.
Anne-Marie was the West's daughter who had bravely come forward and revealed to the police the long history of abuse inflicted by her parents at Cromwell Street.
Which included appalling abuse with contraptions in the basement, of going out with Rose and then effectively being abducted by Fred and Rose and beaten in a car, and binding. So it was all there. And Rose was admitting that. And you think, well, if she's admitting this, it's very much part of the description of what happened to the other girls.
At the conclusion of a trial, Rose West was found guilty of 10 murders and would be sentenced to life in prison. Leo was there to observe her reaction.
That was one of those rare moments where she was totally distraught and devastated. I suppose it was one of those moments of realisation that this is it. She's going to spend the rest of her life in prison and that she's been convicted. In a sense, if she'd seen that coming, she wouldn't have been so devastated. So there was she probably was slightly delusional about the way things were going.
How was this case of Fred and Rose West affected you as a man personally?
It's probably had quite a big impact. And I'm lucky in that I've got a loving, cohesive, supportive family, and that makes a big difference. I think in the early years I tried to, and certainly during the case, I tried to pretend that it was just professional involvement and I could forget about it. But in fact, I think, according to my wife and my eldest daughter, I made everybody else's life hell. So it was obviously having an impact. And I have tried to forget about the case, but to see that close up is It's alarming and sobering, and it's bound to have an impact.
Hearing Leo's words makes me feel that this case, more than any I've ever looked at, saw the solicitors who represented the West subjected to the most scrutiny and pressure of anyone involved in the tragic episode. A pressure that would only intensify under the glare of the media spotlight.
Did you feel any pressure yourself that the press wanted to get access to you and kind of ask for your opinion?
I had to deal with media pressure without any form of training in that regard at all. That was ongoing, and we had the world's press around and about. The press was speculating to such a degree that it needed to be addressed within Parliament, as indeed it was. I had come out subsequently as a gay man, and so there were then issues of literally described as pervert defends pervert, bearing in mind that we're talking about attitudes of over 25 years ago.
How did you feel about that yourself?
You get so busy with what you have to do that anything with regards to yourself, you are putting to the back of your mind.
Do you feel traumatised by being his solicitor?
Certainly, it was a traumatic experience, there's no doubt about that, and there were concerns that I should be psychiatrically debriefed so as to deal with that. Curiously enough, one way of dealing with that is this interview. It's bringing matters to the surface. It's a cleansing, if you like.
Everybody involved in the case of Rosemary and Fred West have been scarred by it. And even after 25 years later, revisiting the scene, it is absolutely daunting.
Despite having spoken to so many leading experts involved in the case, I'm still interested to hear psychologist Dr. Julian Boone's take on how two people could have shared their madness and killed as a folie à deux.
It's so horrible that another person, or two people, Fred and Rose West, can inflict such sadistic torture and eventually murdering these girls. How can they do that to another human being? Is this something about being, I don't know, a sexual psychopath?
Sexual psychopathy fits very well. And if you align that to sadism and a sadistic personality trait, then you've got a very dangerous alignment of the two things, because first of all, you've got the desire for gratification, but if you've got a conscience, particularly you or I have, you couldn't do that sort of thing to someone else. Even if you had the proclivity so to do, you wouldn't do it. If, on the other hand, you're a psychopath, you ain't got no conscience, and you ain't going to go down the shops and buy one, so you're just going to act out, do it, self-gratify.
Rosemary West remains in prison and will never be released. She's very, very kind of reluctant, to talk about anything. Is it just too dark to go back into and think about?
No. And probably the better explanation for why she hasn't talked about anything to do with it is that it's her private world and she doesn't want us to enter into it. It's like a dog in a kennel with his bone. She just doesn't want anybody else to know. That's my preferred explanation for why she doesn't talk. She must know that she's never going to get out of jail. And why she doesn't talk and let people know what happened for the sake of the relatives and all the rest of it. But no, my preferred explanation would be she just wants to keep it all to herself.
And relive it?
Oh, I can't believe otherwise. Yes, I can't believe that she wouldn't relive it. It's so deeply ingrained as a personality characteristic, and there's so many memories of the gratification that I can't believe she wouldn't relive it. Mentally, I mean. So We hear from reports she spends her time knitting. Well, I can't knit. If I could, I'm damn sure I can think at the same time. So, yes, private world, not to be shared.
We must not underestimate the impact of the Fred and Rose West story. 25 years later, it's hard to hear it from a very detached point of view. So when you're in it at that time, that must have been absolute torture to hear it.
All those involved found themselves challenged to the limit. Yet it was also the case which perhaps highlights better than any other how the police and forensic teams can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds to achieve justice for victims.